The air in Aurelia was not merely conditioned, it was curated. It smelled of money, a subtle blend of aged leather from the banquettes, a whisper of truffle oil from the kitchen, and the crisp, clean scent of freshly printed $100 bills that seemed to emanate from the patrons themselves. In this rarefied atmosphere, Alistair Sterling was king. At 62, he was a monument carved from granite and ambition. His silver hair swept back from a face that had forgotten how to smile. His suit, a bespoke creation of charcoal grey, fit him not like a garment, but like a second skin, a layer of armour against a world he viewed as inherently flawed and disappointingly common. He ran a thumb over the rim of his crystal water glass, his gaze sweeping the room with the predatory stillness of a hawk. He saw imperfection everywhere. A waiter whose tie was a millimetre off-centre, a woman whose laugh was a decibel too loud, a faint smudge on the otherwise pristine white tablecloth. Each flaw was a personal affront, a tiny tear in the fabric of the perfect world he had built around himself. His company, Sterling Global, didn't just dominate markets, it consumed them. He was a man who believed in bloodlines, in purity, in the inherent superiority of his own DNA. The Sterling name was a dynasty, and he was its uncompromising patriarch. His dinner companion, a junior senator with malleable principles, was droning on about some tax loophole. Alistair wasn't listening. His attention had been snagged by a waitress moving between tables. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s, with dark, tired eyes that held a spark of defiance. Her uniform, though clean, was slightly frayed at the collar. But it wasn't her uniform that drew Alistair's ire. It was a small dark smudge on her cheek, just below her eye. It looked like chocolate, or perhaps a speck of dirt. To Alistair, it was a stain, a symbol of the carelessness and disorder he so despised. It was filth, present in his sanctuary. The waitress, whose name was Isabella, was on the 12th hour of a double shift. The smudge on her cheek was indeed chocolate, the remnant of a protein bar she had wolfed down in the staff closet 2 minutes before her shift began. Her only meal of the day. Her feet ached, her mind was a fog of orders and feigned pleasantries, and all she could think about was the overdue rent notice tacked to her apartment door. She moved with a practiced economy of motion, her focus narrowed to the task at hand. Refilling water glasses. As she approached Alistair's table, her exhaustion betrayed her. Her hand, holding the heavy glass pitcher, faltered for a fraction of a second. A single crystalline drop of ice water escaped, arcing through the air and landing with an almost imperceptible splash on the gleaming black leather of Alistair Sterling's $1,000 shoe. The senator stopped talking. The air grew thick and heavy. Alistair did not look at his shoe. He slowly, deliberately raised his eyes to meet Isabella's. His face was a mask of cold fury. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice low and dangerously calm. "Isabella, sir," she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. She fumbled for a napkin. "I am so sorry, sir. Let me get that for you." He raised a hand, stopping her. "Don't you dare touch me," he hissed, the words slicing through the silence. "Don't you dare bring your grime any closer." He gestured vaguely at her face. "You walk in here, into a place of distinction, looking like you just crawled out of a sewer. You have filth on your face, and now you have spilled your incompetence onto me." Isabella froze, the napkin clutched in her hand. Her face flushed with a mixture of shame and anger. She could feel the eyes of every diner in the room on her. The smudge on her cheek suddenly felt like a brand. "It was an accident, sir. Accidents are for the weak," Alistair cut her off. "They are the excuses of the inadequate." He rose slowly from his chair, a towering figure of immense wealth and power. He looked down at her, not as a person, but as an object. A piece of faulty equipment that needed to be discarded. "People like you," he said, his voice resonating with utter contempt, "are a disease. You are a blight on a world that strives for perfection." The senator shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The restaurant manager, a man named Philip, was now rushing toward the table, his face pale with panic. "Mr. Sterling, sir, I am so sorry. Anything you need?" Philip began, wringing his hands. Alistair ignored him completely. His focus was entirely on Isabella. He saw her chin lift, saw that defiant spark in her tired eyes flare into a flame. She wasn't cowering. She was meeting his gaze. And that, more than the spilled water, more than the smudge on her cheek, was an unforgivable transgression. In one swift, shocking motion, he raised his hand and slapped her across the face. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent room. It was sharp, ugly, and absolute. Isabella's head snapped to the side, a crimson mark blooming instantly on her skin, ironically covering the very smudge he had found so offensive. She stumbled back a step, her eyes wide with shock, but she did not cry out. A single tear welled, but it did not fall. The silence that followed was profound. It was a vacuum, sucking the air and life from the room. Diners stared, forks frozen halfway to their mouths. The senator looked as if he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. Alistair Sterling stood there, his hand still tingling, his chest heaving with a strange, exhilarating sense of righteousness. He had restored order. He had purged the imperfection. He looked at the red mark on her face, then down at his perfectly clean shoe. He felt nothing but a cold, satisfying sense of victory. "Get her out of my sight," he commanded, his voice a low growl directed at the petrified manager. "And bring me my check. I've lost my appetite." As Philip scurried to do his bidding, practically dragging the stunned Isabella away, Alistair calmly sat back down. He smoothed his tie, took a sip of water, and turned back to the ashen-faced senator. "Now," he said, as if nothing had happened, "where were we?" The slap echoed in Isabella's ears long after she was shoved out the back alley door, her final paycheck and a crumpled termination notice thrust into her hand. The sting on her cheek had subsided into a dull, throbbing ache, a physical manifestation of the humiliation that burned in her soul. She stood in the alley, the stench of garbage and stale grease clinging to the humid night air, and finally allowed the single tear to trace a path down her face. She didn't weep for the job. It was a grueling, thankless position that barely paid her bills. She wept for the casual cruelty, the absolute certainty with which a man could strip another human being of their dignity and face no consequences. Alistair Sterling, meanwhile, felt the incident fade from his mind as quickly as a ripple in a pond. It was insignificant, a minor annoyance that had been dealt with. His mind was already on the next conquest. The following morning, he orchestrated a hostile takeover of a rival tech firm, a ruthless and brilliant maneuver that added another billion to his net worth and put 3,000 people out of work. He read the headlines over his breakfast of black coffee and a single dry piece of toast, a small grim smile touching his lips. This was order. This was control. The world bent to his will. But later that day, in the sterile silence of his penthouse office overlooking the city, something felt off. As he signed a stack of contracts, he noticed a faint tremor in his hand. The pen, a solid gold instrument worth more than Isabella's annual salary, felt unsteady in his grasp. He paused, flexing his fingers. He attributed it to the extra cup of coffee, the lingering adrenaline from the takeover. He was 62, after all. A minor tremor was to be expected. He dismissed it. 2 days later, the tremor returned, accompanied by a fleeting wave of dizziness that made the skyline outside his floor-to-ceiling window seem to tilt and sway. He gripped the edge of his massive mahogany desk, his knuckles white, until the sensation passed. This time, a sliver of unease pierced his armor of self-assurance. Weakness was a concept he did not tolerate, least of all in himself. He called his personal physician, a man he kept on a generous retainer, and demanded a full checkup, framing it as a routine requirement for his life insurance policy. His son, Julian, found him in the study that evening, staring into a glass of untouched scotch. Julian was the antithesis of his father. Where Alistair was sharp angles and cold calculation, Julian was quiet empathy and thoughtful reserve. He had his mother's soft eyes and her gentle disposition, qualities Alistair had always viewed as liabilities. "I heard what happened at Aurelia," Julian said, his voice carefully neutral. The story had been whispered through the city's elite circles, a salacious piece of gossip about the Sterling patriarch's temper. Alistair didn't look up from his glass. "I dealt with an incompetent employee. It was a private matter. You struck a woman, father, in public, for spilling a drop of water." "She was unclean," Alistair stated, the words flat and final. "She brought her squalor into my presence. There are standards. Julian sighed, a sound of weary resignation. They're not standards, they're obsessions. This, this thing you have about perfection, about purity. It's poisoning you. It's been worse since Mom died. Alistair's head snapped up, his eyes flashing with a dangerous light. Do not speak of your mother. She understood. She understood the importance of the Sterling name, of our bloodline, something you have never appreciated. The conversation was over. It was always over when Alistair invoked the sanctity of the Sterling bloodline. It was his religion, his fortress, the justification for all his cruelties. Julian left, the gulf between them wider and deeper than ever. Alistair was alone again, with only the silent city lights for company. He felt a strange tightness in his chest, a cold premonition that coiled in the pit of his stomach. He pushed the feeling away, drowning it with another swallow of scotch. He was Alistair Sterling. He was invincible. The following week was the annual Sterling Global Foundation Gala, the pinnacle of the city's social calendar. It was an event Alistair loathed and orchestrated with equal passion. He hated the forced smiles and the sycophantic chatter, but he understood its necessity. It was a demonstration of power, a night to remind the world that he was not just a king of industry, but a philanthropist, a benefactor. His name, etched in gold on the programs and banners, was what mattered. He stood at the podium, bathed in the warm glow of the stage lights, delivering a speech he hadn't written but had memorized perfectly. He spoke of legacy, of strength, of the unwavering vision of Sterling Global. The applause was thunderous. He felt a surge of familiar power, the feeling of 1,000 influential people hanging on his every word. He was in complete control. And then it happened. The tremor in his hand returned, but this time it was a violent shudder that nearly caused him to drop his note cards. The faces in the crowd began to blur, their features melting together like wax. A wave of intense vertigo washed over him, so powerful he had to grip the sides of the podium to keep from falling. The curated air in the grand ballroom suddenly felt thick and unbreathable, and a crushing weight settled on his chest, as if a block of concrete were pressing down, squeezing the life out of him. He tried to speak, to finish his closing remarks, but only a strangled gasp escaped his lips. His vision tunneled, the edges darkening to black. The last thing he saw was the horrified face of his son, Julian, rushing towards the stage. The last thing he heard was the collective gasp of the crowd as Alistair Sterling, the invincible titan of industry, collapsed behind the podium, his perfect world shattering into a million pieces. The transition from the grand ballroom's opulent splendor to the sterile antiseptic reality of a hospital was brutally swift. One moment, Alistair was a king addressing his court. The next, he was just another body on a gurney, his bespoke suit being cut away by indifferent paramedics. The hushed reverence he commanded was replaced by the urgent, clipped jargon of medical professionals. His power, his name, his billions, they were all useless here. In this realm, the only thing that mattered was the erratic, failing rhythm of his own heart. He awoke to the gentle, rhythmic beeping of a monitor and the soft white of a private hospital suite. The room was luxurious, more hotel than hospital, but it was a cage nonetheless. An IV line snaked into his arm, tethering him to a bag of clear fluid. He felt weak, disoriented, and a deep, unfamiliar fear was a cold knot in his stomach. Julian was sitting in a chair by the window, his face etched with worry. "What happened?" Alistair's voice was a dry rasp. "You collapsed, Dad. At the gala. They think it was a heart attack, but they're not sure," Julian said, his relief at seeing his father awake warring with his anxiety. Alistair tried to sit up, a surge of his old imperious anger rising. "A heart attack? Don't be absurd. I'm in perfect health." The effort sent a dizzying wave through his head, and he fell back against the pillows, a groan escaping his lips. The weakness was infuriating. It was a betrayal by his own body. A man in a white coat entered the room, his demeanor calm and authoritative. He was tall, with kind, intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through the formidable Sterling facade. "Mr. Sterling, I'm Dr. Aris Thorne. I'm the chief of hematology here. I'm glad to see you're awake." "Hematology," Alistair repeated, his voice sharp with suspicion. "I was told I had a cardiac event." "Your heart is under strain, Mr. Sterling, but it's a symptom, not the cause. Dr. Thorne explained, pulling up a chair. "We've been running some tests. Your blood work is, well, it's highly unusual. In fact, in my 20 years of practice, I've never seen anything quite like it." Dr. Thorne went on to explain in calm, measured tones. Alistair was suffering from an extremely rare, aggressive form of myelodysplastic syndrome, a disorder where his bone marrow was failing to produce healthy blood cells. It was a genetic condition, a time bomb hidden deep within his DNA. The dizziness, the tremors, the final collapse, they were all the result of his body slowly shutting down from the inside. "It's treatable," the doctor continued, "but the treatment is radical. You need a bone marrow transplant, immediately." Alistair processed the information with cold, analytical detachment. A problem had been identified. Now a solution would be procured. "Fine," he said. "Get it done. Spare no expense. Find the best donor in the world. I'll pay whatever it takes." Dr. Thorne's expression grew somber. "Mr. Sterling, it's not about money. Finding a compatible donor for a bone marrow transplant is already difficult. It relies on matching specific protein markers on your cells, what we call HLA antigens. For most people, we can find a match in the international registry, maybe 1 in 100,000. He paused, letting the weight of his next word settle. "Your HLA type is not in any registry, anywhere in the world. The genetic markers in your blood are unique, so rare, in fact, that they appear to belong to an incredibly isolated and specific lineage. A genetic bottleneck, from a family line that has remained remarkably pure." The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. Alistair's obsession, the very Sterling bloodline he worshipped as a mark of superiority, was now the source of his death sentence. His pure blood was so unique, so insular, that it was incompatible with the rest of humanity. "What about my son?" Alistair demanded, his eyes darting to Julian. "He is my blood. Test him." Julian nodded immediately. "Of course, whatever it takes." The tests were run with urgent priority. Alistair waited, the silence of the hospital room amplifying the frantic ticking of the clock. This was a new kind of helplessness, one he couldn't bully, buy, or intimidate his way out of. He was at the mercy of biology, of the very blood he had held so sacred. Dr. Thorne returned a few hours later, his face grim. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sterling, Julian is only a half match, as is typical between a parent and child. For this type of transplant, we need a perfect 10 out of 10 match, a genetic twin. A sibling would be the best hope, but I understand you're an only child." Desperation, a raw and terrifying emotion Alistair hadn't felt since he was a poor boy with nothing but a famous last name, began to claw at him. "There must be someone," he rasped. "A cousin, a distant relative. Search the family tree." "We are," Dr. Thorne said gently. "My team is working with genealogists, cross-referencing every known relative in your family's history against every medical database we can get access to. But you need to understand, Mr. Sterling, the genetic marker you carry is what we colloquially call a founder gene. It's like a genetic fingerprint from a single ancestor passed down through a very small, very exclusive gene pool. Some might even call it royal DNA, not in the literal sense of kings and queens, but in its absolute rarity and isolation. Finding a match outside your most immediate family is, statistically speaking, close to impossible, a 1 in a billion chance." Alistair Sterling, the man who had everything, closed his eyes. The beeping of the monitor beside him was the sound of his own life counting down. He was trapped in a prison of his own making, a fortress of blood purity whose walls had just become his tomb. While Alistair Sterling confronted the betrayal of his own biology, Isabella was navigating a different kind of freefall. Losing her job at Aurelia had sent a shockwave through her fragile financial stability. The final paycheck barely covered the late fee on her rent, let alone the rent itself. She spent her days scouring online job boards and her nights lying awake, the phantom sting of Alistair's slap a constant reminder of her powerlessness. The humiliation had faded into a cold, hard knot of anger. She took a temporary job washing dishes in a greasy diner at the edge of town, the work 10 times harder and the pay half of what she made before. Her hands were perpetually raw and chapped, and the smell of old frying oil seemed to cling to her hair and clothes. It was a humbling, soul-crushing existence, but it was work. It was survival. One afternoon, a mobile blood donation bus parked across the street from the diner. A sign in the window offered $50 to donors. To Isabella, $50 was not just money. It was groceries for the week, a payment on her electric bill, a tiny bit of breathing room in a life that was suffocating her. Without a second thought, she untied her stained apron during her break and walked across the street. Inside the bus, she went through the routine questions and the finger prick test. As the nurse prepped her arm, Isabella stared out the window at the grimy street, feeling a profound sense of detachment. She was selling a part of herself, a pint of her own life force, for the price of a cheap meal. It felt like the ultimate culmination of her recent struggles. Another piece of her being commodified and consumed. The process was quick and clinical. As her blood, a deep, rich crimson, filled the plastic bag, she felt a little lightheaded, but also a strange sense of purpose. Maybe this small act, this pint of blood, would help someone. Maybe it would save a life. It was a comforting thought, a tiny flicker of good in a world that had shown her so much ugliness. She took her $50, thanked the nurse, and went back to the diner to scrub burnt eggs off a stack of pans. She gave the donation no further thought. Miles away, in a state-of-the-art laboratory, that same pint of blood was being processed. It was flagged during a routine typing screen. The technician, a young man named Ben, ran the test again, thinking it was a machine error. The results were the same. He called over his supervisor, a woman with 25 years of experience. She looked at the readings, her eyebrows shooting up in disbelief. "Get this to the sequencing lab," she ordered, her voice tight with excitement. "Run a full HLA panel, priority 1. The blood sample, labeled with an anonymous donor number, contained the rarest combination of human leukocyte antigens she had ever seen. It was a perfect match for the impossible profile that had been flagged on the National High-Priority Registry just days before. The one listed for the billionaire, Alistair Sterling. It was the 1 in a billion chance. Back in Alistair's hospital suite, the atmosphere was bleak. The search for a donor had yielded nothing. The genealogists had tracked distant cousins in 3 different countries, but none were a match. Alistair was growing weaker by the day, the colour draining from his face, his imperious energy replaced by a weary fragility. He spent his hours staring at the ceiling, a man forced to confront his own mortality. Dr. Thorne entered the room, his face uncharacteristically animated. He was holding a tablet, his expression a mixture of awe and disbelief. "We've found one," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Sterling, Julian, we've found a donor." Alistair's eyes, which had been dull and listless, snapped into focus. A surge of adrenaline, of hope, coursed through him. "Who is it? Where are they?" "A forgotten branch of the family, a Sterling in hiding." "That's the extraordinary part," Dr. Thorne said, swiping through the data on his tablet. "The donor isn't on any family tree we have. The sample came from a mobile blood drive. An anonymous donation. The only information we have is a name and a last known address from the donation form." Julian leaned forward, his heart pounding. "What's the name?" Dr. Thorne looked down at the tablet, then back at them. "The name on the form is Isabella Rossi." The name meant nothing to Alistair. It was a common, forgettable name. But Julian's face went pale. He remembered the whispers, the gossip from the night of the gala. The name of the waitress his father had struck. It couldn't be. The coincidence was too vast, too cruel. "Isabella Rossi," Julian repeated slowly. "Dad, do you remember the waitress from Aurelia?" Alistair's brow furrowed in annoyance. "What does that have to do with anything? The filthy girl I had fired?" "That was her name," Julian said, his voice filled with a dawning horror. "Her name was Isabella." Dr. Thorne looked between the father and son, sensing a tension he didn't understand. "We need to find her. Her blood isn't just a match, Mr. Sterling. It's a perfect 10 out of 10 match. It's the kind of match we only ever see between identical twins or siblings. Genetically speaking, whoever this woman is, she is the closest living relative you have on this earth." Alistair Sterling stared at the doctor, his mind refusing to process the words. The room began to spin, not from his illness, but from the sheer, earth-shattering impossibility of it all. The person who held the key to his survival, the carrier of his sacred royal DNA, was the very girl he had slapped and cast aside, the one he had deemed nothing more than filth. The task of finding Isabella fell to Julian. His father was too weak and, frankly, too horrified by the revelation to be of any use. Armed with only a name and a week-old address from the blood bank's records, Julian drove to a rundown part of the city he had never visited before. The building was a tenement with crumbling brickwork and a fire escape that looked more decorative than functional. He found her apartment on the 4th floor. The name I. Rossi was written on a slip of paper taped to the door. He knocked, his hand trembling slightly. He had rehearsed what he would say a dozen times, but now, faced with the reality of the situation, the words felt hollow and inadequate. The door opened a crack, held by a chain lock. A pair of wary, tired eyes peered out at him. It was her. Even in the dim hallway light, he recognized the defiant spark in her gaze. She looked thinner than he remembered, and the faint shadow of a bruise still lingered on her cheek. The sight of it sent a jolt of shame through him. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice cautious. "Isabella Rossi?" Julian began, his own voice unsteady. "My name is Julian Sterling. My father is Alistair Sterling." The spark in her eyes turned to ice. The door started to close. "I have nothing to say to you or your father." "Please wait," Julian said, putting a hand on the door. "I'm not here for him. I'm here to apologize. What he did to you was inexcusable. It was monstrous. I am so sorry." His sincerity seemed to surprise her. The door paused. "An apology?" she said, a bitter laugh in her voice. "Does your father send you to clean up all his messes?" "No," Julian admitted, his gaze dropping to the floor. "He doesn't even know I'm here. This is for me. I was there. I saw it and I did nothing. And I've been ashamed ever since." He looked back up, his eyes pleading. "But there's something else, something you have a right to know. It's why I had to find you." He explained everything: the collapse, the rare genetic disorder, the desperate search for a donor, and the impossible discovery in the blood bank. He watched her face as he spoke, saw her expression shift from suspicion to confusion, and finally to stunned disbelief. "You're telling me your father needs my bone marrow to live?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "The man who slapped me and called me filth?" "Yes," Julian said quietly. "The doctors say you're a perfect match, the only one in the world." The cosmic irony was so staggering, so profoundly absurd, that Isabella could only stare at him. The man who had judged her as worthless now needed the very essence of her being to survive. The power dynamic had been flipped so completely it was dizzying. She held his life in her hands. She slowly unlatched the chain and opened the door. "You'd better come in," she said. Her apartment was small and sparse, but impeccably clean. A stack of textbooks sat on a small kitchen table, and a half-finished painting rested on an easel in the corner. This was not the home of the unclean person Alistair had imagined. This was the home of someone who was fighting, striving, creating beauty amidst hardship. Isabella listened as Julian filled in the details, her anger warring with a deep, unsettling sense of shock. Why her? How could this even be possible? The idea that she was related to that monster was repellent. "The doctors don't understand it," Julian finished, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "They say a match this perfect outside of a sibling is a statistical impossibility. They think there has to be a direct family connection we don't know about." He hesitated, then made a decision. "I've hired a private investigator, a genealogist, to look into my family's history, my grandfather's specifically, to see if there's a missing piece, something that could explain this." Isabella said nothing for a long time. She walked over to the window and looked out at the bleak cityscape. She had the power to say no, to walk away and let Alistair Sterling face the consequences of a universe that seemed to have a dark sense of humor. It was what he deserved, justice in its purest, most brutal form. But then she thought of the $50. She had given her blood hoping to help someone, to do some small, anonymous good in the world. She had never imagined this. "I want to see him," she said finally, turning from the window. Her voice was firm, devoid of emotion. "Before I decide anything, I want to see him." The confrontation took place in the hushed, sterile environment of Alistair's private suite. He had been prepped by Julian, but nothing could have prepared him for the sight of Isabella walking into his room. She wasn't wearing a waitress uniform now, but simple jeans and a worn sweater. She looked directly at him, her gaze unwavering. Alistair, propped up by pillows and tethered to machines, looked small. The power and menace had been stripped away, leaving only a frail, sick old man. But the arrogance still flickered in his eyes. "So," he rasped, his voice weak but still laced with contempt, "this is some kind of joke. You, a match for me? It's impossible. Your blood must be tainted." Before Isabella could respond, Dr. Thorne, who had insisted on being present, stepped forward. "Mr. Sterling, with all due respect, science doesn't care about your prejudices," he said sternly. "The lab results are absolute. Miss Rossi's HLA markers are not just a match, they are a mirror of yours. The probability of this occurring by chance is effectively zero. You are related. Closely related." Alistair stared at Isabella, his mind reeling. He saw not the filth he had berated, but a young woman with a strong jawline and familiar, dark, determined eyes. Eyes that reminded him of old photographs of his own father. At that moment, Julian's phone buzzed. It was the private investigator. He stepped out into the hallway to take the call. When he returned a few minutes later, his face was ashen. "I know how," he said, his voice trembling. "The investigator found it. A sealed file in my grandfather's private records, a birth certificate, and a settlement." He looked from his father to Isabella, the missing piece of their shared history finally clicking into place. "My grandfather, Robert Sterling, had an affair. A long one, with a woman who worked as a housekeeper at his country estate. She had a child, a daughter," Julian explained, his words tumbling out. "He paid her to disappear, to give the child up for adoption and never speak of the Sterling name again. That child was adopted by a family named Rossi. They named her Elena." He took a deep breath, his eyes locking with Isabella's. "Elena Rossi was your mother." The room fell into a dead silence, broken only by the steady beeping of Alistair's heart monitor. Isabella felt the floor drop out from beneath her. Her mother, who had died when she was a teenager, had always been a mystery, a woman who never spoke of her own past. Now the secret was laid bare. Alistair Sterling, the man who had humiliated her, was not just a stranger, he was her uncle. The Sterling blood he worshipped, the royal DNA he held as the ultimate mark of superiority, flowed just as purely and powerfully through her veins. The woman he had slapped, cast out, and called a blight upon the world was his own flesh and blood. His brother's secret daughter, his niece. The revelation landed in the sterile hospital room with the force of a physical blow. Alistair Sterling, the man whose entire identity was built on the bedrock of a pure and documented lineage, stared at Isabella as if she were a ghost. The world he had meticulously constructed, a world of clear lines between the worthy and the worthless, had just been demolished. The filth he had despised was not an external contaminant. It was a reflection of his own hidden history, a part of the very bloodline he held sacred. His niece, the daughter of a secret, shameful union between his powerful father and a common housekeeper. In his mind, she was the living embodiment of the imperfection he had spent his life trying to purge. And now she was his only hope for survival. The supreme, crushing irony of it all was more devastating than any disease. His body was failing him, and his ideology had utterly collapsed. Isabella felt a dizzying mix of emotions. There was rage at the injustice of her mother's life, a woman erased from history by the wealth and shame of a powerful man. There was a strange, hollow sense of vindication, but most of all there was a profound and aching sadness. The secret of her origin wasn't a fairy tale discovery of a long-lost, noble family. It was the uncovering of a sordid, painful secret that had cast a shadow over her entire life without her even knowing it. "Get out," Alistair whispered, his voice cracking. He wasn't speaking to Isabella, he was speaking to Julian, to Dr. Thorne, to the ghosts of his father and his own arrogance. "All of you, get out." Julian and Dr. Thorne exchanged a look and quietly left the room, leaving uncle and niece alone in the charged silence. Isabella did not move. She stood by the foot of his bed, a silent sentinel. She watched as the truth worked its way through him, breaking down the decades of pride and prejudice. She saw the mask of the Titan crumble, revealing the terrified, bitter man beneath. "Why?" he finally choked out, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. "Why are you here? For revenge? To watch me die?" "I don't know why I'm here," Isabella answered, her voice steady and clear. "When your son found me, my first thought was to say no, to let you face what you deserve. It would have been justice." She took a step closer. "You didn't just slap me, Mr. Sterling. You tried to erase me. You looked at me and you didn't see a person. You saw a stain that needed to be wiped away. You did to me exactly what your father did to my mother." The words struck him harder than any physical blow. He flinched, turning his head to look at her, really look at her, for the first time. He saw the strength in her posture, the intelligence in her eyes, the sterling eyes, and the profound dignity she carried despite everything. He saw the family resemblance not as a contamination, but as an undeniable truth. "I spent my whole life," he began, his voice thick with a lifetime of unshed grief, "trying to be better than my father. He was a cold man, obsessed with appearances. After my wife, after Eleanor died, that coldness became all I had left. The world had to be perfect, ordered, clean. Because if I could control everything on the outside, maybe I wouldn't feel the chaos on the inside." It was a confession, raw and unexpected. It wasn't an excuse, but for the first time, it was an explanation. He was a man hollowed out by loss who had filled the void with a monstrous obsession with purity. Isabella listened, her anger beginning to soften, replaced by a weary, complicated pity. He was still a monster, but now he was a monster with a story. A human story. "I am asking you," he said, the words costing him every last shred of his pride, "not as Alistair Sterling, the billionaire, but as a dying man. I am asking you to save my life, and I know I have no right." Isabella held his gaze for a long moment. The power was hers. The choice was hers. She could walk out that door and he would be dead within a month. She could claim her justice. But as she looked at him, she didn't just see the man who had hurt her. She saw the last living link to her mother, the only other person on earth who shared this strange, secret blood. Letting him die would be an act of anger, but saving him could be an act of power, an act of grace that he could never comprehend. "I will do it," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I will be your donor." Alistair's eyes widened, and for the first time they filled with tears. A wave of relief so profound it was almost painful washed over him. "But not for you," Isabella continued, her voice hardening slightly. "And not for your money. I don't want a single cent from you. I'm not doing this to become a part of the Sterling family. I'm doing this for my mother, Eleanor, the woman your family tried to forget. I'm doing it to prove that her blood, my blood, is a source of life, not shame." She laid out her terms. He would make a full public apology to her. He would establish a foundation in her mother's name, dedicated to helping single mothers and adopted children. And the foundation would be run not by him, but by Julian. "I'm doing this for me," she concluded, "because I will not let your bitterness and your cruelty turn me into you. I will not be the kind of person who stands by and watches another human being die, even if it's you." Alistair Sterling, the man who had dictated terms his entire life, could only nod in acceptance, humbled and broken by the magnanimity of the woman he had so grievously wronged. The weeks that followed were a crucible for them all. The bone marrow transplant was an arduous and painful process for both donor and recipient. Isabella endured the procedures with quiet fortitude, her resolve never wavering. Alistair, stripped of his physical strength, was forced into a state of total dependence, a humbling experience that continued the slow, agonizing erosion of his pride. During his long recovery, he was a changed man. The biting sarcasm and imperious demands were gone, replaced by a quiet, contemplative silence. He had Julian bring him the few photographs he had of his father, and he would stare at them for hours, re-examining a man he thought he knew, searching for the secrets he had kept. True to her word, Isabella refused all financial compensation. When Alistair was finally strong enough, he fulfilled his side of the bargain. He called a press conference, and in front of the world's media, he stood, looking frail but resolute, with Isabella by his side. He didn't just apologize for the incident at the restaurant. He told the whole story. He spoke of his father's secret, of the niece he never knew he had, and of how her grace had saved his life. He publicly acknowledged Eleanor Rossi, giving her a place in the sterling history that had been denied to her. It was an act of profound self-immolation for a man who had lived his life in a fortress of secrets, and it was the beginning of his redemption. The Elena Rossi Foundation was established, with Julian at the helm, and it quickly became a major force for good in the city. Alistair poured hundreds of millions into it, his old ruthlessness now channeled into a new purpose. His relationship with Isabella remained tentative and complex. The wound he had inflicted was too deep to be healed by a single apology or a charitable foundation. He was her uncle, but he was also her tormentor. She did not embrace him as family, but she did not shut him out completely either. Months later, she agreed to meet him for coffee. It was at a small, unassuming cafe, far from the opulent world of Aurelia. Alistair arrived not in a chauffeured limousine, but in a simple town car he drove himself. He wore a plain sweater, not a bespoke suit. They sat in awkward silence for a few moments, two strangers bound by blood and a shared, painful past. "I looked at your paintings," Alistair said finally, his voice soft. "Julian showed me. You have a remarkable talent. You have your grandmother's eye." Isabella looked up, surprised. "You knew she painted?" "My father kept one of her paintings," he admitted, "a small landscape. It was hidden in the back of his study. I never knew who painted it until the investigator found her name. He must have loved her in his own broken way." It was a small offering, a piece of a shared history, a bridge across the chasm between them. Isabella thought of her own easel, of the joy she found in creation. For the first time, she felt a flicker of connection to this man. Not through the myth of a royal bloodline, but through the shared human legacy of a grandmother she never knew. The healing was not complete, and the future was uncertain. The scars remained. But as they sat there, sipping their coffee, a quiet understanding began to form. Their story was not one of a billionaire and a waitress, but of two broken people who had, through an impossible twist of fate, been given a second chance. A chance to rebuild not on a foundation of pride and purity, but on the messy, complicated, and ultimately redemptive truth of their shared humanity.